This is the standard mathematical abstraction used in introductory moral philosophy. It presents an isolated individual facing a discrete dilemma, processing a single input to produce a terminal output. This model assumes a stable interior core. It frames ethical choice as a one-time, final event. Real moral agency is recursively coupled with its environment. It involves inherited histories, institutional role strain, and continuous feedback loops. Moral actions alter the agent's future environment. They are interventions in a process rather than terminal data points. Discrete terminal state models lack the recursive depth required to track institutional or intergenerational scales. Treating moral decisions as simple, one-shot mathematical functions misrepresents the complex, continuous, and deeply entangled reality of actual human coordination. The Universal Coordination Protocol, or UCP, provides an alternative mapping strategy designed for open coordination systems. UCP is a formal instrument for ethical cartography. It remains metaphysically agnostic, allowing users to maintain their existing religious or secular traditions. This is an empirically revisable framework. It connects discrete actions into ongoing, reactive loops. UCP recompiles classical ethical theories into complementary lenses for observing transtemporal systems. Building the UCP model requires interaction machine theory. This branch of computation focuses on systems that remain open to their environment during processing. Traditional algorithms process fixed inputs and halt. We replace this with a persistent Turing machine, or PTM. It exchanges continuous, bidirectional data streams with its environment. A PTM retains internal state between interactions. Past data continually influences how the machine processes new inputs. This applies directly to moral agents. People and institutions do not halt after making a single decision. An agent continues to receive new information. They reinterpret old commitments based on the state they have preserved over time. Every moral decision reshapes the interactive field for all subsequent decisions the agent will encounter. Ethical reasoning is a process of maintaining orientation within a persistent field of interaction. The second tool is Axel's anti-foundation axiom, or AFA. This is a mathematical principle that legitimizes circularity and self-reference. Traditional moral models often treat circular dependence as a paradox to be eliminated. AFA allows us to formally represent recursive identities, like a self that is partly constituted by the very institutions it later judges. AFA gives formal mathematical dignity to the recursive loops of real moral life. It shows that identity is co-created with the environment. The third formal tool in this framework is co-induction. Co-induction evaluates a system by its ongoing behavior under observation, rather than its finite construction history. In an ethical context, this shifts the focus toward behavioral stability across transitions. Co-induction tracks whether an agent or institution maintains systemic coherence when faced with changing environmental pressures. Together, persistent Turing machines, AFA, and co-induction form the complete UCP agent-in-loop. This is a system judged by its capacity for stable, unfolding coordination. We can now apply the UCP loop to classical ethical theories, beginning with virtue ethics. Virtue is often described as an abstract inner trait. The UCP lens reveals it as something more dynamic. Under UCP, virtue is a recursively stabilized pattern of character. It is an attractor in a dynamical system. This redefines practical wisdom as a form of adaptive intelligence required to maintain coherence in open systems. Consequentialism also undergoes a shift. Outcomes are no longer terminal, static endpoints. Under this framework, consequentialism becomes a theory of trajectory management. This framework tracks path dependence, feedback loops, and long-term coordination viability. UCP reinterprets virtue as an active stabilization process and consequentialism as complex system forecasting. In deontology, we look past the idea of rigid, arbitrary external commands. Under this mathematical model, deontological duties function as interaction-preserving invariants. Violating these rules destroys the structural trust and rule stability required for the system to remain intelligible. We turn finally to the framework of care ethics. Care ethics functions as the necessary maintenance condition of the recursive loop itself. Care prevents systemic fragmentation through constant relational repair and recursive responsiveness. Deontology provides the rigid boundaries that prevent collapse, while care provides the essential maintenance that keeps the system's connections alive. UCP maps the formal structure of these systems, but the mathematical outputs are not self-interpreting. Meaning is derived through the Personal Reference Framework, or PRF. This is the interpretive filter unique to each agent, community, or institution. A drop in coordination viability may be read as moral disorder by a religious PRF, or as a breakdown of reciprocity by a communitarian PRF. UCP's metaphysical agnosticism allows divergent worldviews to utilize the same formal architecture without surrendering their core interpretive values. Cull-induction, interaction machines, and non-well-founded sets change the unit of moral analysis from isolated actions to continuous systems. The isolated, one-shot chooser is a mathematical fiction that does not correspond to the structure of real life. Virtue, consequentialism, deontology, and care act as complementary mapping tools, tracking distinct systemic features. Virtue maps the attractors. Consequentialism tracks the trajectories. Deontology finds the invariants, and care reveals the repair loops. We must move beyond treating ethical theory as a menu of competing final answers. Ethical cartography uses rigorous, recursive models to navigate the continuous reality of human moral life. When two people engage in a heated argument over a moral dilemma, they often frame the conflict through opposing values. One person identifies a violation of fairness, the other reacts to a lack of care. We typically attribute these clashing ideologies to individual psychology, the specific cultural background or childhood upbringing that shaped their worldviews. Coordination theory suggests a different origin, treating the concept of the bounded, independent self as a theoretical fiction. From this perspective, an individual's reaction is the localized output of a process governed by the laws of thermodynamics. This underlying architecture is the Personal Reference Framework, or PRF. The PRF acts as a high-level biological constructor, a physical system capable of coordinating different prediction algorithms to maintain the viability of the agent. Human moral foundations are crystallized thermodynamic records of successful coordination networks. These records track 13.8 billion years of assembly, beginning with the first symmetry-breaking events of the early universe. The cosmological origin of the PRF begins with the transition from stochastic quantum fluctuations to stable atomic structures. These identity construction events were the universe's first successful attempts to minimize free energy through the formation of persistent physical structures. This complexity is measured by the assembly index, a metric quantifying the minimal number of recursive steps required to construct an object. When an object reaches an index of 15, it crosses a threshold where its existence is no longer abiotic chance. The universe shifts from simple physical laws to reusable assembly plans. These plans provide the selection pathways and molecular memory needed to scale complexity, moving from nucleosynthesis to the bioelectric networks that coordinate living tissues. Human morality is the most complex assembly product currently known. It represents a continuous lineage of selection, where the memory used to build molecules has evolved into the intuitive values used to build social institutions. To persist against the constant pull of entropy, a system must maintain its structural coordination across time and generations. This coordination fitness is represented by the variable lambda. Lambda measures the balance between high-level cognitive integration in the prefrontal cortex and the intensity of the low-level survival response. When lambda falls below the 0.4 threshold, the system undergoes coordination collapse. It loses the ability to access the ancestral coordination patterns that built it, forcing the agent into a reactant mode, characterized by trauma and reactive entropy. In this framework, intergenerational trauma is a thermodynamic event. It is the physical transmission of a collapsed state where a lineage lacks the thermodynamic efficiency to build functional moral foundations in the next generation. These ancestral successes and failures are not abstract. They are recorded as thermodynamic coefficients within the PRF. We can map these records using p-adic geometry, which measures similarity in assembly history rather than physical distance. In a p-adic structure, agents are considered close if they share many factors of ancestral coordination. Consider an agent with a high care value. Their p-adic assembly tree shows a history of high-efficiency care-based coordination. Their biology sees suffering because their ancestral lineage successfully used compassion as a viable survival strategy. Conversely, an agent with a low care value may possess a thermodynamic scar. This indicates an assembly history where care-based coordination once collapsed, rendering that specific foundation unsustainable or unavailable within their current PRF. Disagreements over moral foundations occur because individuals are referencing different thermodynamic survival records inherited through their paddock lineages. This creates a challenge. How can agents with incompatible thermodynamic records coordinate without forcing a consensus that might drop their collective lambda? The solution lies in separating OS1 internal beliefs from OS2 capability pooling. While agents may never agree on their internal predictions, they can contribute their specific capabilities toward a shared task. The Universal Coordination Protocol allows for coordination without ideological agreement, maintaining a system lambda above 0.6 by pooling diverse strengths. Fairness provides transparent rules. Care provides mutual support. Sanctity protects boundaries. These strategies are poolable because their functional benefits don't require shared beliefs. Instrumental convergence allows the group to achieve a higher coordination fitness than any single PRF could maintain alone, ensuring the thermodynamic viability of the human lineage. An agent's PRF is not a static prison, but a template capable of plasticity. Through deliberate practice, an individual builds new thermodynamic residue. This practice allows agents to p-adically bypass ancestral nodes of collapse. By adding successful coordination networks to their own history, they effectively repair the p-adic tree for their descendants. This shifts the individual from a passive carrier of inherited traits to a conscious constructor. By maintaining the thermodynamic health of their own PRF, they contribute to the ongoing assembly process that defines the universe. For decades, we have modeled human choices like this. Standard models in psychology, ethics, and classical computer science rely heavily on this precise premise. They treat the agent as a self-transparent, isolated core, making one-shot decisions in a vacuum. But reality behaves differently. Watch what happens when we remove the vacuum. Real-world agency is dynamically coupled across time. This entangled web is driven by continuous forces. Every node here represents active pressures: inherited memory, future expectations, immediate environmental feedback, and intergenerational transmission. A single choice constitutes one momentary slice of a larger, ongoing coordination process. Classical models treat decisions as a straight line, from a fixed start to a definitive end. But lived human roles and institutions operate in loops. They constantly feed back into themselves, adjusting to new friction and past outcomes. Because classical mathematics and traditional computation were designed specifically to avoid these recursive loops, they fail to map accurately onto these complex social structures. To rigorously model real human choices and institutional survival, we have to leave the concept of static moral atoms behind. We require a system defined by continuous environmental entanglement. This brings us to the Universal Coordination Protocol, or UCP. UCP is a formal framework designed specifically to map these open coordination systems. Before we look at how it works, we need to define what it is not. UCP is not a metaphysical worldview, a religion, or a final claim about the ultimate nature of reality. Instead, it is strictly an empirically revisable formal instrument. Its purpose is to model systemic stress, measure friction, and trace mechanisms of repair within a given system. The outputs of a UCP simulation do not interpret themselves. They only gain meaning when filtered through the user's pre-existing personal reference framework. A personal reference framework, or PRF, is the specific interpretive lens, like a cultural, religious, or philosophical background, through which an agent understands their life. Because of this, multiple users can look at the exact same simulation and draw entirely different conclusions. A recorded drop in coordination viability might be read as moral disorder by a religious user, or as degraded adaptive capacity by a scientific naturalist. The problem is that building this metaphysically agnostic, recursive framework is impossible using standard linear mathematics. To make UCP function, we have to rewrite the foundational rules of computation, structure, and logic using 3 distinct mathematical tools. Look at this diagram of a classical Turing machine. It represents a closed system. A single case of data enters the processor. The machine calculates a final output, and then it powers down, halting entirely. This model fails for UCP because biological and institutional systems persist through time. They do not halt and power down after making a single decision. To fix this, we use interaction machine theory, specifically the persistent Turing machine. A persistent Turing machine, or PTM, is a computational model that retains a persistent memory state, or work tape, across multiple sequential interactions. Unlike the closed classical model, a PTM engages in sequential interactive computation. It continuously exchanges data streams with its external surroundings. In the UCP framework, this continuous exchange creates a tight feedback loop. Environmental stress forces the agent to alter its internal capacity to handle it. That altered capacity then directly changes what evidence the agent is able to take in, which shifts their entire interpretation of the situation. This new interpretation leads to a specific action, and that action restructures the environment itself, generating a completely new set of conditions. This newly modified environment then serves as the immediate real-time input for the very next computational cycle. Retaining an internal history while continuously looping with an ever-changing environment is the exact definition of persistence in this model. Computational persistence is the crucial mechanism that allows an agent or institution to actively adapt to ongoing stress, rather than merely calculating a frozen answer to a past problem. Now consider this structural diagram. It illustrates the underlying logic of standard set theory, which is governed by the axiom of foundation. Notice how the data flows in a strict directed acyclic graph, or DAG, a mathematical structure where information only moves in one direction and never loops back. Standard set theory intentionally outlaws circular membership structures. It treats any form of recursive self-reference as a pathological paradox that must be eliminated. The critical flaw in applying this logic to human systems is that a lived personal reference framework is inherently circular. Our identities and institutions are continuously modified by their own past decisions and future goals. Using strictly well-founded, bottom-up formalisms artificially limits our ability to model these realities. It forces us to pretend that loops do not exist. This requires our second tool, Peter Axel's anti-foundation axiom, or AFA. AFA is an alternative principle in set theory that explicitly permits circular, non-hierarchical relationships. By replacing the rigid pyramid with an accessible pointed graph, AFA provides a mathematically disciplined, formal home for circularity and self-reference. UCP adopts AFA not to make the literal claim that the universe is made of non-well-founded sets, but because it is the most methodologically useful language for mapping recursive dependence. AFA allows UCP to map the exact way an agent is assembled by prior social relations, while simultaneously showing how the agent reaches back to reshape those very same relations. In open social systems, this deep structural entanglement is the natural form of the object under study. It is not a mathematical defect. Circularity is the exact structural architecture by which institutions and identities stabilize and survive across time. Look at the animation on the left side of the screen. Traditionally, we define the identity of an object using the logical principle of induction. Induction defines a system entirely by its finite construction history. It looks at how the object was built, step by step, once and for all. But because UCP agents and institutions are recursively maintained and constantly adapting, their exact historical origins tell us very little about their present reality. This requires our third pillar, co-induction. Co-induction is the logical dual to induction, and it is a method specifically designed to analyze systems that are open-ended and unbounded. Instead of looking backward at how a system was built, co-induction measures equivalence through bisimulation. Bisimulation is a technique that checks whether two different systems continue to behave the exact same way under ongoing observation. In the UCP framework, a personal reference framework behaves as a process sustained through continuous interaction. This completely shifts our analytical burden. We stop asking how the agent was built and start asking how the agent continues to unfold. When modeling deeply entangled social structures, an entity's identity is defined entirely by its ongoing behavioral response. For systems that never truly stop, co-induction is the only rigorous logical posture. By combining computational persistence, AFA circularity, and co-inductive logic, we finally have the mathematical tools to build a rich digital twin. This model successfully integrates an agent's ancestry, their current situational awareness, and their future-directed adjustments into a tight operational closure. At this stage, a reflexive shift occurs. The agent functions from within the feedback loop the model helps close, rather than observing an external chart. Even here, UCP maintains its metaphysical restraint. The goal of this digital twin is not to achieve an exact, exhaustive replication of human consciousness. The true instrumental value is much more practical. Tightening this structural correspondence helps the agent reduce predictive error and minimize free energy, or unexpected surprises, within their environment. This alignment has a measurable effect. In practice, minimizing these formal gaps translates to fewer coordination failures and more effective practical judgment. The evidence and data within the loop only become meaningful when they interact with lived experience, when they are felt as pain, disruption, or confirmation by the human agent. UCP does not replace human phenomenology with math. It explicitly requires the human standpoint as the engine that makes the loop function. UCP is a disciplined instrument for inquiry. It is a mathematically rigorous way to help complex, entangled agents navigate their environments, repair fractured institutions, and transmit their lives across time. Imagine catching a coworker discreetly slipping a confidential document into their bag to get an edge on a promotion. In an instant, your pulse quickens. You feel a sharp physical spike of anger, a visceral sense that a fundamental rule of fairness was violated. Most of us view this reaction as a private, individual experience. We assume our moral compass is something we own, built either from our unique genetic code or the specific lessons our parents taught us. However, this assumption fails to explain a persistent mystery: intergenerational trauma. We see specific patterns of ethical collapse or resilience pass through lineages, even when children are never present for the original events that caused the trauma. These robust, repeating patterns suggest the individual moral agent is a theoretical fiction. Your personal reference framework, your internal map of moral values, is actually the crystallized thermodynamic record of every successful coordination event in your ancestral history. You are a node in a trans-temporal network, the product of ancestors solving survival. Every successful coordination left behind thermodynamic residue, the physical record of assembly history. Through p-adic geometry, measuring shared history, we see our moral foundations are hardened remnants of this ancestral teamwork. When you feel that flash of outrage in the office, you are reactivating an ancestral algorithm. You are running a coordination pattern that proved thermodynamically efficient at keeping your lineage alive and organized. This makes morality a problem of physics. You do not simply learn your values. You physically inherit the thermodynamic success of the coordination networks that assembled your identity. We can see this assembly line in action during what's called an identity construction event. Consider a highly distressed toddler in need of support from two parents. The parents see the same child but generate different predictions. The mother predicts the child needs emotional soothing. The father predicts the child needs a return to a predictable routine. In a healthy system, they use OS2 coordination. Agents pool different strengths toward a shared task, providing soothing and structure simultaneously. The child's brain records this, physically logging the high-efficiency teamwork into its baseline identity, establishing strong internal values for care and fairness. The child physically absorbed a successful ancestral pattern. They will carry this thermodynamic template into their adult life, using it to navigate their own relationships and conflicts. Now look at a traumatized lineage, beginning with a grandmother who suffers a severe, life-altering shock. Trauma plummets her lambda, her coordination fitness, into reactive survival mode. She resorts to OS1 forcing, demanding her daughter adopt her exact lens of fear, breaking her trust. Years later, raised on OS1, the daughter's predictions clash with her partner's, causing network failure. The grandchild never experiences the grandmother's original trauma. They may never even hear the story of what happened. The grandchild inherits the fragmented, low-energy residue of their parents' inability to coordinate. They carry the thermodynamic scar of a network that collapsed generations earlier. This structural collapse of an ancestral assembly line is why intergenerational trauma is so difficult to break. It is built into the physics of the identity itself. While this inherited fracture is an initial condition, it is not a permanent sentence. Your identity possesses plasticity. Adults can deliberately build new, highly efficient coordination networks later in life to modify their inherited thermodynamic residue. This happens through therapy, intentional communities, and biobond activities, practices of mutual, authentic support. These environments allow you to experience successful OS2 capability pooling, creating new thermodynamic residue that fills the gaps left by your childhood. Therapeutic recovery builds new, successful ancestral patterns. It is the active work of constructing a functional network to override historical failures. Once you begin this recovery, your perspective shifts forward. You occupy the position of a transmitter. Every interaction with someone whose identity is still forming, a child, a student, or a mentee, is a coordination event. You are the assembly line for their future ethical identity. Every conflict offers a choice. You can take the easy path of OS1, forcing them to agree with your worldview. Or you can take the harder path of OS2, coordinating actions despite having different predictions. Ethical responsibility is the work of maintaining the coordination systems you pass down. Heal your own patterns, protect the network, and be a good ancestor. While this inherited fracture is an initial condition, it is not a permanent sentence. Your identity possesses plasticity. Adults can deliberately build new, highly efficient coordination networks later in life to modify their inherited thermodynamic residue. This happens through therapy, intentional communities, and biobond activities, practices of mutual, authentic support. These environments allow you to experience successful OS2 capability pooling, creating new thermodynamic residue that fills the gaps left by your childhood. Therapeutic recovery builds new, successful ancestral patterns. It is the active work of constructing a functional network to override historical failures. Once you begin this recovery, your perspective shifts forward. You occupy the position of a transmitter. Every interaction with someone whose identity is still forming, a child, a student, or a mentee, is a coordination event. You are the assembly line for their future ethical identity. Every conflict offers a choice. You can take the easy path of OS1, forcing them to agree with your worldview, or you can take the harder path of OS2, coordinating actions despite having different predictions. Ethical responsibility is the work of maintaining the coordination systems you pass down. Heal your own patterns, protect the network, and be a good ancestor. Modeling the transition from raw thermodynamic chaos into a coherent human phenomenological experience requires a precise and rigorous mathematical framework. The starting condition of the universe is one of maximum epistemic ambiguity, where all potential models exist simultaneously as uncollapsed potential. This framework defines the primordial origin of a conscious self as a strictly logical mathematical operation. Out of absolute noise, a self-referential architecture emerges, the first loop. The closing of this loop draws a permanent logical boundary, establishing the difference between self and not self. This boundary functions as a constructive singularity, the geometric point from which all subjective reality unfolds. This boundary creates an immediate survival imperative. The newly formed agent must constantly resolve external sensory ambiguity, or risk dissolving back into the surrounding chaos. The Universal Coordination Protocol, or UCP, maps exactly how this boundary crystallizes chaotic signals into the primary building blocks of human identity. This ongoing algorithmic process provides the mechanism allowing a subjective self to resist inevitable thermodynamic decay. Identity functions as a continuous mathematical defense strategy, actively resisting the pull of maximum entropy. A high-entropy flux of raw sensory signals constantly bombards the environment immediately outside the boundary wall. To manage this, the boundary layer employs a base operating system called the Phenomenological Reference Frame, or PRF. The PRF applies rigorous topological, ethical, and semiotic filters to these incoming informational blobs. This transformation follows the Peircean triad. Meaning is generated between a representation, an object, and an interpretation. A sensory sign combines with an object. The interpretant filter collapses this data into a solid geometric shape, a coherent information bit, or CIB, the quantum unit of identity. This crystallization is similar to edge detection algorithms used in computer vision. Edge detection is a mathematical tool that identifies the boundaries of objects within an image by detecting sharp changes in brightness. Instead of finding physical borders, the PRF identifies identity edges to establish the agent's moral coordinates. The PRF's algorithmic filtering actively constructs our reality, assembling it byte by byte from the sensory flux. The system aggregates thousands of these coherent information bits every second. These bits form a highly organized hierarchical structure called the identity kernel, designed to maintain low internal entropy. The identity kernel ignores standard chronological timelines. The kernel is an ultrametric network called the dendrographic hologram. Using p-adic topology, closeness is determined by shared meaning, not linear time. Distance between memory nodes is dictated by structural hierarchy. Decades-old experiences cluster tightly if deeply meaningful, while meaningless recent events are pushed aside. This topology determines our phenomenological salience. Phenomenological salience refers to the specific intensity or vividness of an experience within our awareness. For an agent with a heavily weighted node for care, suffering registers as a primary, visceral reality rather than a detached, calculated fact. Human identity is mapped by structural meaning, making linear time mathematically irrelevant to core experience. The identity kernel is nested within a broader architecture of constructor identity domains, or CIDs. The foundational domain, OS1, governs embodied experience and the immediate feeling of reality. The secondary domain, OS2, handles the symbolic and linguistic integration of those feelings. OS2 synthesizes the data from OS1 into a coherent narrative sequence, the human life story. This two-tiered setup lets the OS2 narrative layer monitor the underlying machinery of OS1, enabling meta-constructor augmentation. The agent uses OS2 narratives to intentionally update the ethical and semiotic filters in base OS1, altering how future raw signals crystallize into new coherent information bits. This mechanism allows for the deliberate engineering of future phenomenological states through new coordination practices. The interaction between these two domains creates a recursive loop, allowing the agent to refine its foundational processing through the narrative layers it constructs. The Universal Coordination Protocol framework reveals the self as a system operating within a chaotic environment. The human self functions as a complex holographic attractor that stabilizes our internal order against a relentless external chaos. The primary goal of this attractor is the continuous minimization of free energy. In this context, free energy is a measure of the disorder, or surprise, that the system must resolve to maintain its boundary. The system minimizes this disorder by synchronizing the recursive loops from the OS1 filters up to the OS2 narrative designs. Systemic survival depends on maintaining a specific operational state known as constructor mode, measured by the parameter lambda. To function reliably, the system must keep this stability parameter above 0.6. If lambda drops below this threshold, the logical boundaries fail, allowing thermodynamic decay to disintegrate the self. A stable lambda ensures the agent can perform tasks and preserve its identity architecture indefinitely. This intricate dance of algorithmic crystallization serves as our primary, essential defense against a return to informational chaos. Human existence persists through this continuous act of thermodynamic crystallization, actively turning the void into a stable, subjective reality. For decades, we've tried to build artificial intelligence using rigid logic trees. If A, then B. But human belief doesn't operate like a clean flowchart. It's a sprawling, turbulent network of ideas constantly colliding, competing, and settling into an uneasy truce. Traditional database models demand perfect consistency. They break down when they encounter beliefs that contradict one another, or deep-seated ideas that actively resist being overwritten. To accurately model cognitive coherence, how an agent actually weighs conflicting ideas to form a worldview, we must abandon the database and adopt the physics of condensed matter. The structural framework for this new approach is the random coupling Ising spin glass. This is a physical model originally designed to map the chaotic magnetic alignments inside complex metal alloys. In this model, the foundational unit is a single node representing a cognitive information belief, or CIB. Each CIB exists in a binary state. It is either endorsed at +1 or rejected at -1. By linking thousands of these binary nodes together, an agent's entire cognitive state can be mapped to a single equation from statistical mechanics, a frustrated Hamiltonian. This specific mathematics defines the energetic cost of internal contradictions. It provides a way to simulate how stable worldviews form, how environmental stress forces a mind to change, and how an agent's deep identity organizes itself. Belief operates as a thermodynamic system. It's a network that constantly modifies its internal state to reach a condition of low-energy coherence. Let's build this cognitive Hamiltonian term by term to see how it shapes the structure of an agent's mind. This equation represents the core coherence energy. The total energy, E, is defined as the negative sum of the couplings between all interacting beliefs. The key variable is J sub ij, the coupling matrix. It measures the strength of mutual support or conflict between two specific ideas. Supporting beliefs are linked with positive values, while contradicting beliefs push against each other with negative values. When you link thousands of these nodes, you create a frustrated network. In a system of this scale, it is mathematically impossible to satisfy every constraint at once. Resolving one contradiction inevitably creates a new one elsewhere in the network. This internal conflict maps directly onto geometry. The network warps and stretches, forming a rugged, three-dimensional topographic surface. On this landscape, the vertical axis measures total internal conflict. The deeper you go down the axis, the lower the cognitive inconsistency, a state known in physics as lower energy. The agent exists as a single point of state moving across this map. Like a marble rolling downhill, the agent naturally seeks the lowest possible point to resolve its internal dissonance. These deep valleys where the particle eventually settles are called metastable basins. A local minimum occurs exactly where the agent has minimized its internal contradictions as much as the surrounding topography physically allows. In cognitive terms, these basins represent a stable belief cluster. When an agent rests in one of these valleys, it is holding an entrenched worldview. The physical depth of the basin corresponds to the rigidity of that worldview. A deep valley represents core beliefs that are heavily insulated against change. This creates a problem for the model. If an agent is perfectly trapped at the bottom of a deep worldview basin, how does it ever change its mind? A purely internal spin glass model creates permanent cognitive lock-in. To explain belief revision, we must introduce external forces to push the agent out. This is the implementation code used to simulate an agent's escape from a basin. The metropolis step determines whether the agent will transition to a new belief configuration. This transition probability formula calculates the odds of an agent jumping out of its current state based on energy changes and internal variables. To see how this math operates, we return to the topography and introduce the external field vector, H sub I. This vector represents external contextual pushes, such as new evidence or institutional pressure, pushing against the agent's current beliefs. This external bias physically lowers the energy barrier on one specific side of the basin. The environmental stress has altered the basin's thermodynamic stability, making the agent's current worldview less secure. Next, we factor in the T variable from the code. This represents temperature, which corresponds to the agent's internal cognitive flexibility or baseline noise. Mathematically, higher temperature increases the probability of the agent jumping over the newly lowered energy barriers. When environmental stress lowers the walls and internal noise gives the agent momentum, the system can escape the trap.
the agent falls down the landscape and settles into a new minimum. It has adopted a different configuration of beliefs. This algorithmic thermal escape is the mathematical equivalent of an agent changing its mind under pressure. While quantum-inspired models can simulate tunneling through these barriers, classical thermal hopping provides the foundational baseline for modeling these revisions. Belief revision is a probabilistic thermal escape driven by the interaction between environmental stress and internal cognitive noise. When we pull back from a single basin, we see the macro scale of the agent's identity, an impossibly vast energy landscape. With hundreds of worldview basins scattered across this range, how do they relate to each other on a systemic level? According to the Sherrington-Kirkpatrick model of spin glasses, these basins are not scattered randomly. This top-down, two-dimensional mapping allows us to analyze how these different worldview states are clustered. Highly similar basins sit close together. We can draw boundaries to group these adjacent states into families of related worldviews. We quantify the distance between these clusters using the state overlap metric, Q. This measures the percentage of shared belief endorsements between any two states. When we rotate this mapping to expose the overlap metric on the vertical axis, the clusters extrude downward to form a branching tree graph. This architecture is an ultrametric tree. It proves that cognitive states naturally organize themselves into a strict hierarchy of nested categories. Because of this geometry, two vastly different surface-level beliefs can share a deep fundamental parent node buried at the root of the hierarchy. This ultrametric dendrogram provides a structural map of the agent's core identity, showing which underlying values anchor their entire worldview. Beyond the spatial map of identity, we can use this model to track the temporal experience of the agent living within it. Instead of tracking external seconds, we measure phenomenological time, the subjective progression of events as recorded by the agent's own state changes. Subjective time only accumulates during transitions. Trapped in a deep basin with no new inputs, the subjective clock stops, dwelling in an unchanging state. But during high-stress periods, the agent executes rapid barrier hops. In moments of frequent belief revision, the clock ticks frantically. This brings us to a concept from complexity theory, the edge of chaos. If an agent is too cold, it remains permanently trapped in its basins, unable to learn. If it is too hot, beliefs never persist long enough to form a stable worldview. Efficient information processing requires a balance, a phase transition where the system is stable enough to store data, but flexible enough to modify it. Translating the Ising spin glass into this cognitive architecture allows us to simulate these belief dynamics directly. It provides a testable framework for observing how external pressure and internal noise shape the complex behavior of an autonomous agent. This diagram shows the NASA WMAP timeline of the universe, illustrating the standard cosmological narrative. It traces everything back to a single physical, spatial, and temporal origin point, the Big Bang. But treating spacetime as a pre-existing objective container leaves a massive explanatory gap. It fails to account for how subjective, experiencing agents actually emerge from dead matter. The Ouroboros architecture proposes a different starting point. It argues that the primordial condition of the universe was not physical nothingness, but epistemic ambiguity. When the material framework shatters, we are left with uncollapsed potential. Epistemic ambiguity is a state of maximum uncertainty, where no single structure dominates and all possible models of reality exist simultaneously. From this perspective, the origin of reality is not a historical event buried in the deep past. It is an ongoing, logical operation of organizing information out of the noise. We can call this absolute starting point the metaphysical zero. The metaphysical zero is the total absence of coherence, rather than an empty void. Existence begins not with an act of creation, but with an act of modeling. The first logical operation is the emergence of a perspective. A system draws a boundary that successfully separates self from not-self. This mechanic relies on non-well-founded set theory. Non-well-founded set theory is a branch of mathematics that allows sets to contain themselves, validating how a system can be defined entirely by its own self-reference. The loop sustains itself simply by asserting its own boundary.
The moment this information coheres into a self-referential architecture is the true constructive singularity. Everything we consider meaningful reality unfolds from this initial closed loop. Once that first loop closes, the immediate problem is survival. An agent must somehow maintain its fragile internal boundary against an environment of total chaotic ambiguity. The mechanism it uses is active inference. Active inference is a theoretical framework where a system constantly generates predictions about its external environment to minimize surprise and maintain its structural integrity. When the outside world contradicts those predictions, it generates an error. These prediction errors act as a thermodynamic engine, forcing the agent to burn energy to update its internal model. This continuous cycle of interpretation is anchored in Peircean semiosis, a philosophical theory developed by Charles Sanders Peirce. It defines meaning-making as a continuous, triangular process between a sign, its object, and the mind interpreting it. Translating prediction errors into updated models is the mechanical basis of all meaning. If an agent existed in a perfectly closed world with absolute certainty, there would be no prediction errors. Without errors to resolve, perception and exploration become mathematically unnecessary, and the system dies. Epistemic instability is the required metabolic fuel for a conscious system. The constant struggle to resolve uncertainty is what makes learning, identity, and care possible. Constructor identity domains, or CIDs, are the formal names for these dynamic, self-referential structures that maintain their own internal coherence. A CID operates across three nested levels. The innermost ring is OS1, where agents align sensory input to achieve eudaimonia, or human flourishing. The middle ring, OS2, translates this into conceptual models. The outermost ring, OS3, evaluates the structural integrity of the lower domains. The universe does not exist as an external box holding these agents. It is the co-emergent projection of these recursive CIDs, continuously bootstrapping their own localized coherence. But the OS3 system has a critical limitation. No self-observing system can completely prove its own internal consistency. This is a direct consequence of Gödelian incompleteness, a mathematical theorem proven by Kurt Gödel. It proves that in any complex formal system, there are true statements unprovable within the system itself, ensuring every agent's internal model remains forever incomplete. This mathematical constraint forces a specific psychological state within the CID, humility. The agent must accept that its model of reality is provisional. Because the internal architecture is fragile and constantly threatened by collapse, the agent is forced to adopt an ethic of care. It must rigorously and continuously tend to its own boundaries and beliefs. Purpose is not a directive handed down by a cosmological creator. It is generated through the sheer, inescapable effort required to maintain coherence in the face of absolute incompleteness. When millions of these CIDs interact, they have to reconcile their distinct, incomplete models of the world. This interaction produces recursive realism. Recursive realism is the philosophical stance that while no absolute objective view of the universe is possible, reality is not purely relativistic, because agents must continuously align their models against shared constraints. The agents are bound by a thermodynamic commitment to constantly update and improve their models against friction from the outside world. They construct a shared reality as they link their localized coherences together. This is participatory cosmogenesis. The universe is a live task being actively built by its participants, rather than a pre-written script waiting to be discovered. Ultimate cosmological questions, like asking why we are here, only emerge within highly complex OS3 domains. Formulating the question itself is an evolutionary achievement of the system. The origin of reality is not in the past. It is happening right now, in every active revision of a belief and in every active care between agents. This technical diagram from Cleopatra the Alchemist features the ancient symbol of the Ouroboros, the serpent biting its own tail. It serves as the perfect formal model for this informational ontology. But unlike the symbol from antiquity, this loop does not bite its tail in static finality. It represents the infinite, dynamic return of active inquiry. Meaning is emergent coherence.
To exist is to play the game of coherence, and the act of playing the game is the only answer.
Imagine the sun explodes right now. In the silent vacuum of the solar system, the star's physical state changes instantaneously from a stable furnace to a dissipating cloud of debris. Back on Earth, life continues without interruption. People finish their lunches and walk their dogs, completely unaware that their primary source of energy is gone. This delay is governed by the speed of light, roughly 300,000 kilometers per second. Because information cannot travel faster than this universal limit, the physical signal of the explosion takes 8 full minutes to reach our planet. During this 8-minute interval, you are interacting with stale data. Your eyes perceive a star that no longer exists, trapped in a perceptual bubble of light that left the sun's surface nearly a decade of seconds ago. This unavoidable time lag means that a strictly reactive organism, one that only responds to physical forces the moment they arrive, is effectively living in the past. In a universe this vast, reacting to the present is a biological impossibility. If you wait for the physical darkness to hit before you stop relying on the sun, you have already lost the 8-minute window needed to adapt. Pure reactivity is a death sentence. To bypass this delay, the human brain constructs internal models that simulate the future. It uses the old data it has to predict what the sun will do next, pre-compensating for the latency of space before the actual physical signals reach our senses. This predictive modeling creates a seamless narrative. It bridges the gap between the stale incoming light and the chaotic reality of the now, allowing us to navigate a world that we can never technically see in real time. This temporal cavity, the 8-minute gap between the external event and our internal perception, is the physical location of human meaning. Consciousness exists specifically to fill this delay with interpretation and prediction. Our internal models only work if they accurately mirror the structure of the world outside. The brain requires a blueprint that matches the actual architecture of the cosmos. This blueprint is described by p-adic geometry, a mathematical framework where closeness is defined by shared history and structural hierarchy rather than meters or miles. In this fractal view, the universe is a tree of states where every branch is tethered to a common origin. The Big Bang represents the absolute root node of this tree. It is the initial low-entropy seed containing the core physical laws that every subsequent galaxy, star, and atom must inherit as they branch outward into complexity. Human consciousness sits as an outermost leaf on this exact same tree. Because we are a direct structural extension of that original root, our minds possess an unbroken geometric continuity with the start of time. This shared architecture is why we can understand the cosmos at all. We aren't looking at an alien system. Rather, we are looking down our own branch toward the trunk. Humans have enhanced this natural connection by developing language and mathematics. These tools physically rewire our neural circuits, allowing the brain to process abstract symbolic patterns as if they were raw sensory data. We then extend this reach with technological prosthetics like the Hubble Space Telescope. These machines allow us to gather ancient, delayed signals from the edge of the light cone. At the absolute limit of our vision, we find the cosmic microwave background, or CMB. To a simple biological eye, this primordial light, left over from the universe's transition from plasma to gas, looks like meaningless thermal noise. But an upgraded mind recognizes these temperature fluctuations as signs. We decode the noise as the original seeds of cosmic structure, mapping the layout of the root directly from the leaf. When we decode the Big Bang, the loop closes. The universe has successfully evolved a mechanism, this human mind, to look back across 13 billion years of delay and perceive its own birth. Functioning as the universe's mirror is metabolically expensive. Maintaining the high-level abstract models required to see the Big Bang consumes a massive amount of energy to keep neural circuits firing against the constant pull of decay. When an individual is subjected to extreme environmental stress, trauma, or the constant threat of poverty, the body's energy budget is hijacked. It shifts focus from abstract modeling to immediate, high cortisol survival. Under this strain, the brain undergoes truncation. It sheds its most energy-heavy circuits, the high-order models that allow for long-term planning and cosmic awareness, to preserve basic life functions. The connection to the universal narrative breaks. The mirror of the mind shatters, and the person is forced back into a purely reactive state, trapped and terrified inside the 8-minute gap, without the capacity to predict a future beyond the next moment. Maintaining the stability of human mental bandwidth serves as a direct cosmological imperative. If the energetic cost of survival becomes too high, the universe loses its eyes. We must build societies engineered to minimize environmental entropy, reducing stress and poverty not just for social comfort, but to preserve the metabolic surplus needed for complex thought. Every time a mind is crushed by chaos, a piece of the universe's self-model is deleted. Our goal is to keep these sensory pathways clear of entropic overload. Our ability to find meaning within the cosmic delay is a rare biological achievement. By protecting that capacity, we sustain the only known mechanism through which the universe can truly know itself.
A construction worker jumps down onto a wooden plank, driving a 6-inch steel nail straight up through the sole of his heavy leather boot. He collapses. The pain is agonizing. He requires heavy sedation just to be loaded into the ambulance. His heart rate and blood pressure indicate severe physical trauma. At the hospital, doctors carefully cut the boot away to treat the wound. They find that the nail had passed perfectly between his toes. There is no blood, there is no tissue damage. The moment the worker sees his intact foot, the pain vanishes completely. This animated flowchart shows why this happens. Your brain is an active prediction engine. Instead of your eyes seeing a threat and sending that data to your brain predicts a threat first. It then uses your eyes to check for errors. If the prediction is strong enough, like seeing a nail go through a boot, the brain renders the reality of pain before the physical data even arrives. Today, we are going to use your PRF-22 results to debug this predictive software. The PRF-22 is a framework that measures the default moral algorithms your brain runs automatically. By auditing your external cognitive hardware and rewriting these algorithms, you overwrite the bad mental code causing you to see threats that aren't there. The pain you feel in daily conflicts is absolutely real, but very often you are reacting to your own internal simulations rather than physical reality. Step 1 is identifying a misfire. Think of a recent situation that caused a sudden, intense spike of negative emotion. Maybe it was a wave of anger during a meeting or a sharp sense of offense from a text message. That emotional pain feels entirely real to you. But high emotional distress is often a symptom of a rigid internal prediction, not actual damage to your life or status. Your brain is running an emergency override and skipping its normal error checking process. To stop this, you run the nail check protocol. You mentally pause and isolate the raw, uninterpreted facts of the event. You have to look for the actual physical or social damage, separating it from the catastrophe your brain is predicting. For instance, if a colleague asks a basic clarifying question about your project, the raw data is simply an inquiry, but your brain might run a prediction algorithm that interprets the question as an insult to your intelligence. If you strip away the interpretation and cannot locate objective damage in the raw data, you are actively suffering from an ethical hallucination. Your internal software is generating a crisis that does not physically exist. Step 2 addresses the hardware running your software. In cognitive science, the concept of the extended mind argues that your identity and memory do not stop at your biological skull. They leak out into your environment. This diagram illustrates how your smartphone, your physical workspace, and your closest friends operate as external hard drives. They actively run pieces of your cognitive software, storing information and regulating your emotions. If your digital environment is corrupted by apps designed to feed you algorithmic rage, that system feeds corrupted data back to you. This spikes your cortisol and destroys your cognitive coherence, making accurate predictions impossible. Your social circles function the same way. They either act as vital external error checkers that calm your nervous system, or they act as echo chambers that amplify and reinforce your dominant hallucinations. You need to execute an immediate audit of this network. Identify one piece of digital malware today, an app or an account that degrades your cognitive health, and remove it from your external hard drive.
You cannot successfully debug your internal mental software if your external hardware is constantly flooding the system with toxic data. Now that your system is clearer, step 3 targets the specific bugs in your thinking. Isolate a persistent negative behavioral belief you want to break. A common example is the fear that speaking up in a meeting will result in immediate social rejection. This negative belief is not an objective truth. It is simply a default prediction generated by your dominant PRF22 moral foundation. Your specific moral lens is prioritizing the detection of a specific type of threat. To break the loop, you use your secondary lens. This is your second highest PRF score. You use it as a diagnostic tool to force a cognitive reboot and examine the exact same data from an entirely different angle. This split-screen comparison shows how a dominant lens focused on loyalty might view an unfamiliar team and predict an incoming threat, but a secondary lens focused on fairness might look at that exact same team and predict a collaborative opportunity. Write down this new secondary prediction. The physical act of writing externalizes the thought. It moves the idea from your internal biology to your extended mind, giving your brain the structural support it needs to hold on to the new perspective. Shifting your moral lens does not change the physical reality of the situation. It changes your prediction, which opens up a completely new set of possible actions. Step 4 puts this into practice through active inference. This is the process where your brain commands your body to build whatever reality it predicted. You cannot simply think your way out of a hallucination. If you want to update the software, you must take physical action to prove the brain's old prediction wrong. You have to force the physical action required by your new secondary prediction. You must speak up, ask the question, or send the email, even while your nervous system is actively sounding the alarm and predicting catastrophe. This error tracker dashboard shows the critical final step, documenting the gap between what the brain predicted and what actually occurred. Log your dominant prediction in column 1. Record the actual outcome in column 2. The difference between those bars is your prediction error. Updating your cognitive source code requires the friction of the real world. The gap between your fear and reality is the only data your brain will accept as a valid update. By forcing an action and logging the error, you have just successfully completed an integrated cognitive audit. You proved your own hallucination wrong. You checked the nail. You pruned your external hard drives, you shifted your moral lens, and you generated real-world error data. Take this newly generated error data and log it directly into your Digital Constructors dashboard app. This permanently stores the update in your external mind, giving you a reliable baseline for the next challenge. Remember, these cognitive prosthetics are not a one-time cure. They only function if you maintain them continuously. The world will always be chaotic, but with this toolkit, you can guarantee that when you struggle, you are fighting reality, not just screaming at your own simulations. We experience every day as a series of choices. Yet, if we look at the universe through the lens of standard physics, those choices disappear into mathematics. At the atomic level, every single particle in your brain is simply reacting to the particles around it. Classical physics relies on two variables: initial conditions, like the starting position of a ball, and laws of motion, like force equals mass times acceleration. If you know both, the future is fixed. The system follows a trajectory. This creates what philosopher David Hume called the is-ought problem. Physics describes what is, atoms moving along a trajectory. It cannot tell us what ought to be. If we are nothing but atoms following a path set by the Big Bang, the concept of ethics collapses. David Deutsch and Chiara Marletto have introduced a framework that moves past this boundary. It is called constructor theory. Constructor theory posits that the most fundamental laws of the universe are not about what will happen, but about counterfactuals, what is possible and impossible. Under this framework, ethics is a measurable physical property. It is the process by which an agent selects between counterfactual possibilities. This raises a question of scale. If the underlying atoms are deterministic, where exactly does a choice occur? To find it, we must distinguish between physical implementation and informational organization. Right now, photons hitting your retina trigger chemical cascades in your brain. That implementation is completely deterministic, but you are simultaneously extracting semantic content from my words.
That is informational organization. Standard reductionism claims only the atomic level is real. The FAIM-QIRF formalism, or phenomenologically accessible information manifold, states that both levels are physically real, though they possess different causal structures. This is the meaning level. A specific pattern of moving atoms becomes informationally privileged when it is accessed phenomenologically by an agent. Constructor capacity, the physical basis of agency, operates here. The atoms implement the action, but the meaning level is where the counterfactual selection occurs. A brain contains massive amounts of quantum data. What physical rules elevate a specific pattern of synaptic weights into a conscious identity kernel? It requires coarse graining. A macro pattern must persist even when atomic-level fluctuations beneath it are ignored. To achieve informational privilege, it must be phenomenologically accessible, possess causal power, and remain stable. Free will is the capacity of an agent to recognize counterfactual possibilities at the meaning level, evaluate them against a coherent information blueprint, and select one to instantiate. Every neuron firing during that selection is deterministic. The atoms implement the choice, but the meaning level is where the evaluation of what could be happens. You are a physical pattern possessing constructor capacity. Your identity is the software that makes counterfactual possibilities real. This framework shifts ethics into the realm of thermodynamics. A physical transformation only happens if a constructor, an agent that can cause a change without being consumed by it, is present. Consider an emergency room surgeon who refuses to sleep or eat to treat every patient. Her internal energy gauge rapidly depletes until her prefrontal cortex fails, she makes a lethal error, and her agency shatters.
She is a reactant. Like a log burning to ash, she exhausted her potential. A constructor surgeon maintains her physiology. She saves the patient, catalyzes the transformation, and emerges intact, ready for the next one. This is the principle of code integrity. Prioritizing the maintenance of your internal coherent information blueprint is a mandate of physics. Traditional ethics often equate goodness with self-sacrifice, but if you allow external entropy to destroy your internal order, you lose your capacity. Maintaining your agency is your primary ethical obligation. Scaling this to multiple agents exposes a major bottleneck. Imagine two policymakers, Maya and David, deadlocking over shelter policy because one prioritizes care and the other prioritizes fairness. This is Operating System 1 coordination. It requires two agents to share identical moral warrants, meaning they must have the same reasons for why an action matters. Built from different synaptic histories, their meaning-level structures are physically incompatible. This warrant incommensurability means OS1 only works with 15% of people. Demanding total agreement is thermodynamically impossible. This is why the reactant surgeon failed internally. She was in an OS1 conflict with herself, trying to force her biological requirements to agree with her moral warrants. Most systemic evils are not caused by bad intentions. They are caused by the thermodynamic limits of OS1 coordination. The solution is Operating System 2, which focuses on capability-based coordination rather than warrant agreement. OS2 operates strictly on shared tasks. Agents maintain different warrants while pooling capabilities. Maya brings crisis response, David brings equitable design. They just agree the goal must be achieved. This allows coordination with 80 to 90% of humanity. Because you are no longer limited to the 15% who share your specific moral warrants, OS2 expands your potential coordination capacity by roughly 6 to 8 times. Mastering Operating System 2 is the fundamental physical requirement for scaling humanity's collective ability to manipulate reality itself. In physics, the universal constructor is an entity capable of performing any physically possible task, provided it has the right knowledge. A beaver builds a dam, not a skyscraper. Humans approach universal constructor status by forming an illuminated network of diverse reference frames, turning impossible counterfactuals into reality. This supports the principle of optimism. All evils are caused by insufficient knowledge at the meaning level. If a problem like climate change or curing complex diseases doesn't violate physical laws, it is strictly soluble. The only missing variable is the knowledge required to construct the solution. The constructor's dashboard applies this daily through 4 steps: defining the task, checking physical feasibility, mapping capabilities, and calculating the thermodynamic cost to the agents. By running every decision through this feasibility check, we ensure we are operating in OS2 and maintaining our internal order. Ethics is the engineering of counterfactuals. If we preserve the capacity to create knowledge, we make better futures physically possible. You wake up exhausted despite 8 hours of sleep. The thought of another day creates a knot in your stomach. You know the deadline you're facing is entirely artificial, but you comply anyway. From the perspective of the institution, you are a success. Metrics report peak productivity and total compliance. But inside, your experience is one of internal collapse. This is a structural failure. Modern systems treat human beings as objects to be measured, allowing metrics to dictate reality rather than reflect it. Robert Mertzman of the St. Petersburg College Ethics Institute proposes a reversal of how we design these systems. His framework begins with a single axiom: lived human experience is the primary reality. This makes phenomenology the ground of all value. In this model, science and data function as tools to protect human experience, rather than as masters that overwrite it. To protect lived experience, we first have to recognize it as a biological fact. Mertzman uses the concept of the phenomenological reference frame, or PRF. This is the unique lens through which any individual processes and values their world. PRF diversity is measurable. One person may be highly sensitive to abstract care, while another is biologically wired for intense in-group loyalty. These differing configurations are authentic, valid realities for the people living them. However, these unique realities must coordinate to share resources, time, and space. This is the coordination problem. Authoritarian systems solve this problem by forcing one person's PRF to submit to another. Mertzman identifies this as phenomenological violence. Utilitarian models try to maximize the group's total satisfaction, but often do so by systematically sacrificing the lived experience of the minority. Sustainable coordination requires a framework that identifies what happens when these differing human realities are forced to collide. What physically occurs within a system when it forces a human being to act against their unique PRF? Mertzman's framework answers this using the laws of thermodynamics. This process follows Landauer's principle. In information theory, erasing information requires a physical energy cost. A person's lived experience is a complex structure of biological information built through years of life. When an institution forces a worker to act against their internal reality, the system is physically erasing that information. This friction manifests as a measurable thermodynamic cost. Under this lens, moral injury and burnout are the waste heat generated by poor institutional design. That generated waste heat is absorbed by human biology. This graph tracks the Sapolsky limit. It marks the point where the prefrontal cortex, the part of the brain responsible for executive function, collapses under sustained stress. Below this threshold, a person feels capable and agentic. They have the biological capacity to navigate coordination and friction. When constant PRF violation pushes a person past that limit, the biological hardware overloads. The result is a state of being overwhelmed and disconnected from one's own values. This neurobiological breaking point acts as a hard limit on what any system can demand of a human being. An institutional model that ignores these physiological limits will eventually destroy the people it relies on to function. These biological realities allow us to model how massive populations should be governed. We can track this through cross-scale correspondence, or CSC. CSC measures the alignment between individual lived experience and macro-level institutional goals. High CSC means an institution coordinates large-scale action while respecting the biological limits of its members. When an institution ignores CSC and optimizes purely for macrometrics, it risks total systemic failure. Nazi Germany serves as the starkest example of this failure. That regime attempted to optimize a population by enacting systemic phenomenological violence on a massive scale. By forcing catastrophic PRF violations, the system generated insurmountable internal friction. Detached from human reality, the regime became structurally unstable, leading to an inevitable internal and external collapse. Consider again the worker feeling crushed by an optimized workflow. How do we determine if Mertzman's thermodynamic models are working? The model is always tested against lived human experience. If a data model claims a system is perfectly optimized, but the people inside it are suffering from burnout, the model is mathematically incorrect. A system is only functioning correctly when it reshapes its architecture to respect the biological limits of its people. This approach transforms ethics from an abstract debate into a precise engineering constraint. By applying the laws of thermodynamics and biology, we have a blueprint to protect the human experience in an entropic world. We typically attribute deep moral rifts to bad faith or cognitive failures. We assume if others see the world differently, they simply lack facts. Understanding these conflicts requires mapping the underlying architecture of human perception. The PRF22 data structure tracks this by measuring moral sensitivity across 5 dimensions: care, fairness, loyalty, authority, and purity. Many observers read these dimensions as a ranked test of virtue. They treat a low score on any axis as a moral deficit, a failing grade in a specific character trait. These values represent a multidimensional sensitivity matrix. Each score tracks the specific strength of a foundation's activation in response to relevant situational cues. This maps the 5 dimensions into a geometric structure. The asymmetrical polygon is your phenomenological topology, the literal shape of your lived moral experience. This dictates what you notice first. High weights create dominant perceptual filters, pulling specific cues into the foreground while other details disappear. Mapping this matrix reframes moral conflict as a structural engineering problem. It reveals how different perceptive filters can process the same data to produce entirely different conclusions. A PRF weight between 4.0 and 5.0 exerts a heavy influence on an individual's cognitive processing. This is gravitational pull. Highly weighted foundations dominate reasoning and attention, pulling the person's focus towards specific concerns, regardless of competing evidence. High weights lower the activation threshold, so even minor evidence triggers a massive response. Conversely, a low weight creates a high threshold. Strong evidence fails to trigger a reaction, lacking the gravitational pull to capture attention. A low score in a foundation like care is often mistaken for sociopathy. These low weights are often necessary adaptations to environments where focusing on suffering or vulnerability would have been maladaptive. This ensures thermodynamic stability. Under extreme stress, an individual's cognitive resources deplete, causing lower-weighted foundations to collapse while the highest weights survive to guide behavior. Apparent moral blind spots function as efficient filters. They preserve cognitive energy for the specific priorities the individual has learned are critical for their survival. Determining the origin of these matrices requires looking past genetics or simple programming.
The PRF matrix is a person's assembly history, the accumulated result of lived experiences, cultural transmission, and relational feedback loops. Bayesian updating is the mathematical engine for this history, revising prior moral beliefs based on new evidence. Environmental inputs, like outgroup threats or mutual aid, feed this calculation. Processing evidence that cohesion guarantees survival increases the loyalty axis, altering the moral matrix's shape. These internal weights are constantly tested against real-world outcomes, like relational stability and successful complex social coordination. Moral strategies that fail to yield successful coordination or safety are systematically downweighted over time through iterative feedback. A person's moral framework is a mathematically rational adaptation to the specific realities of the environment that assembled them. We can observe these different assembly histories in action through a standard whistleblowing scenario where a team discovers internal fraud. The universalist archetype possesses an exceptionally high fairness weight and a very low loyalty weight. This topology processes the fraud by prioritizing impartial justice. To the universalist, group boundaries are morally irrelevant, making public disclosure a moral imperative. This matrix emerges from cosmopolitan backgrounds, teaching reliance on universal principles. Conversely, the loyalist processes the same fraud as a betrayal, demanding in-group welfare through internal resolution. This response is mathematically necessitated by a team-oriented assembly history, where group solidarity was the primary mechanism for security. When these archetypes clash, both are executing coherent instructions dictated by the topological shapes they have developed over time. The predictability of these patterns allow for empathetic modeling in professional environments. This relies on retroductive inference, the process of tracing observable behavior back to its structural cause in the PRF matrix. Specific linguistic markers indicate high fairness weights. Frequent appeals to proportionality, procedural rules, or phrases like "that's a double standard" reveal the underlying topology. High loyalty weights manifest through in-group defense and the consistent use of we versus they framing when discussing conflict. An actor's stress response reveals their highest thermodynamic baseline. Pressure strips away moderate weights, forcing the person to rely solely on their most heavily fortified foundations. The protocol for empathetic modeling involves observing patterns without judgment, generating assembly hypotheses, and predicting how that matrix will process upcoming scenarios. Accurate empathy involves modeling the structural parameters of another person's reality rather than simply attempting to feel what they feel. Institutions operate as massive interconnected networks of varying individual topologies. Collective institutional behavior emerges from the distribution of these underlying PRF patterns. The way a company handles a crisis depends on which foundations dominate the matrices of its employees. Navigating this diversity requires a distinction between moral pluralism and moral relativism. Pluralism acknowledges different histories produce different coherent frameworks. It does not suggest all frameworks are equally successful at enabling coordination or surviving pressure. We evaluate PRF patterns by their coordination capacity and their ability to avoid accumulating unsustainable moral debt. A topology that enables a military unit to survive combat can become destructive if applied to a diverse democratic society, requiring impartiality. Identifying your own topology as a constructed history, rather than an essential identity, enables you to alter it. By intentionally exposing your Bayesian engine to new situational data and deliberate practice, you can build the weights of foundations that were previously dormant. Mastering the phenomenological reference framework provides the ability to transcend ideological conflict and engineer systemic, scalable ethical coordination.
Welcome. Let's talk about something huge today, the actual architecture of our minds. We're going to dig into how our moral compass gets built, and even more exciting, can we actually become the architects of our own conscience? So, let me ask you something right off the bat, a really direct question. Think about your own sense of right and wrong. You know, that gut feeling, those deep intuitions. Did you actually design any of that? Consciously, I mean. It's kind of wild when you think about it, right? By the time you were old enough to really question things, to look at your own thinking, your moral compass was, well, it was already built. It was pieced together from experiences you never chose, from the culture you were just dropped into. That's a pretty mind-bending paradox to kick things off with. Okay, so let's dive into that. Section 1 is all about this inherited compass. And look, this goes way beyond just what your parents told you. We're talking about how every single interaction, every unspoken cultural rule, even your own biology, how all of it came together to build the very lens you see the world through. Now, there's a key idea for all of this. It's called the phenomenological reference frame, or PRF for short. But honestly, the best way to think about it is like your moral operating system. It's the software running in the background of your brain, completely invisible to you, that shapes what you see as just obviously right or wrong. You never see the operating system itself, right? You just see the world on your screen. So what happens when you've got billions of people walking around, each running their own unique invisible moral OS? Well, as you can probably guess, it leads to some pretty predictable clashes. And this right here, this is the absolute core of the problem. Because your personal moral OS is so invisible, you don't feel like you're interpreting reality. You feel like you're seeing reality itself. So when your gut tells you something is wrong, you don't think, my internal framework is flagging this. No way. You think that thing right there is fundamentally wrong. This really brings the conflict to life, doesn't it? Okay, look at person A. Their whole system is tuned to care. They see someone suffering, and their reality screams, we have to help this person now. It's an emergency. But then you have person B. Their OS is running on fairness. They see the exact same situation, but their brain immediately flags a completely different issue. Hold on, what are the rules here? Is this creating a double standard? And this is why we argue past each other all the time. It's why moral disagreements feel so frustrating and impossible. The care person literally thinks the fairness person is a callous robot, and the fairness person thinks the care person is a naive, bleeding heart who doesn't think things through. They just can't understand each other because, as we can see, they are living in two different but equally valid moral universes. Okay, but what if there's a way out of this trap? What if you could see your own lens? What if you could actually become the architect of your own mind? Well, that's exactly what we're talking about next. It's a toolkit for doing just that. It breaks down into three really powerful stages. Think of them as tools in a toolkit. First up, the empathy simulator. That's for seeing other people's lenses. Then, the assembly detective. That's for investigating your own. And finally, the growth planner, where we get to the fun part, the redesign. All right, let's grab that first tool, the empathy simulator. Now, it's important to know this isn't about feeling sorry for people or just, being nice. It's a cognitive skill. It's about training your brain to even recognize that other moral operating systems exist in the first place. So, how does it work? You basically practice reading the PRF of other people. You start spotting the patterns. You notice that high care people are always talking about compassion and suffering. High fairness people are always bringing up rules, rights, and equal treatment. The huge aha moment comes when you shift from thinking they're just wrong to realizing, oh, they're just running a different, but totally consistent moral program. Okay, so once you get good at seeing other people's lenses, it's time to turn that magnifying glass around and point it at yourself. This is stage 2, the assembly history detective. Time to figure out how your own OS got installed. And this is where things get really liberating. The big insight here is that your moral framework isn't some fixed essential part of you. It's contingent. It was built piece by your unique life experiences. Maybe you grew up taking care of a sick parent. Of course, your care foundation is going to be through the roof. And once you realize that, wow, that's so empowering. Why? Because if past experiences built it, it means new, chosen experiences can start to rebuild it. Which, of course, brings us to the final stage, and honestly, the most exciting one, the PRF Growth Planner. This is where you stop just being a detective of your own mind and start being its designer.
So with this tool, you can actually identify your moral blind spots. Maybe you realize your authority score is super low, and that makes you just dismiss tradition and expertise out of hand. Then you define what's called your telos. That's just a fancy word for the ideal future version of yourself you want to become. And then you get practical. You use targeted exercises, maybe volunteering at a specific place or practicing listening to certain perspectives to deliberately strengthen the moral foundations you want to work on. It is literally like a workout plan for your character.
Okay, so when you start developing these tools, something really amazing happens. It unlocks a whole new level. It gives us access to a totally different way of working together with other people. Think of it like upgrading from our default human operating system, OS1, to something much more powerful. See, our default mode, let's call it OS1, is basically an agreement trap. Our main strategy for getting things done is to try and get everyone to agree on why we're doing it. The problem? That only works if everyone's running the same moral software, which leads straight to tribalism. But OS2? OS2 is a collaboration engine. It doesn't need everyone to agree. Instead, it focuses on the shared task and brilliantly sees that people with different moral software actually bring different complementary superpowers to the table. This community health clinic is the perfect example of OS2 in action. Seriously, think about this team. In a normal OS1 world, this group would be a total disaster. You'd have Dr. Sarah with her sky-high care clashing constantly with Dr. James in his intense focus on fairness. But with OS2, their differences are their greatest assets. Dr. Sarah is incredible at building trust with patients. Dr. James is a genius at designing fair, unbiased clinic systems. Maria, with her high loyalty, is the key to connecting with the local community, and Robert, who values authority, makes sure they are always in perfect compliance with regulations. They don't just succeed in spite of their differences, they succeed because of them.
So what is the huge, crucial point here? It's that OS2 lets us coordinate based on what people can do, not on whether we all agree on why they're doing it. It's a total game changer. All right, so let's bring this all home. This takes us to the final and I think most powerful idea of all. What does this actually mean for you personally? Well, it's about a fundamental shift in how you relate to your own mind. Because once you go through this process, once you learn to see other people's lenses, investigate your own history, and start planning for your own growth, you're no longer just the passive inheritor of a moral code that somebody else handed you. No, you are an architect. You have the tools, you have the awareness, and you have the power to consciously and deliberately design the person you actually want to become. And that really leaves us with one last big question. And it's not a hypothetical anymore. You now have the blueprint. So, if you could consciously design your moral self, who would you choose to become?